In this screencast, we're going to look at how we can build Microsoft Teams customizations using the SharePoint Framework. In this first section, we're going to just do an overview where we can understand Microsoft Teams development, the benefits using the SharePoint Framework to extend Microsoft Teams, and then how to surface SharePoint Framework customizations in Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams provides many different extensibility options. You can create a Teams app which can consist of a custom tab. It could also leverage bots, messaging extensions, and connectors. Or you can also build a custom bot, which would reply and receive messages from a user to have a nice little interaction experience with your users. Now, let's take a look at an overview of building a Microsoft Teams tab. So the way you would do it is you first have to design your tab. You want to select your relevant application functionality. You're going to want to have a scope and focus on what the user experience is going to be and integrate and streamline access to the application. So you can have anything that you want inside of this custom tab here. You're then going to need to go develop your tab. Now, the way this is done is all using web technologies, using HTML and JavaScript or TypeScript, and you're going to communicate with external services using the REST protocol or REST standard, which is an HTTP-based service. You're also going to have the ability to provide deep linking so that you can jump straight to a specific spot inside of your tab using custom links. Once you've built your application, they're going to deploy your tab. And the way you do that is you're going to upload it directly to a Microsoft Teams team, or you can upload it to a tenant app gallery. And that's going to be a gallery where anybody within your organization will be able to install things inside that gallery. Or you can even deploy this to the Office store, and that's going to give us the ability to share our application with other people outside of our tenant. Now let's talk a little bit about the tab configuration and the content. So the tab configuration is all going to be configured inside of a manifest file. So that's going to define what different things we can do inside the configuration. This is going to be displayed when the tab has been added to the channel, and it's going to collect some information for you. Now, as you're going to see with the SharePoint Framework, things work mostly the same way. There's a little subtle difference that we'll look at when we get into the third section of this section or this screencast. But you'll see it's still pretty straightforward. And the content within a tab, all of this is rendered inside of an iframe. So you're going to have a URL that's going to be specified by the configuration page that's going to specify where you should load the application from. You can expect the context for the entity ID or the sub-entity ID, and you can also receive state based on the entity or the sub-entity or the user in question. Now, how do you interact with Microsoft Teams from a tab? Well, the Teams API, it's a JavaScript-based API, is going to provide context for a user or a team or an organization. You can get context through URL placeholders, which are placeholders that are specified in the URL within the manifest. And those are going to be resolved at runtime. The placeholders for each of the property of the context object is also going to be available to us. So you can see we have a bunch of noteworthy properties down at the bottom that we can access here for like a team ID, a channel ID, the locale, entity ID, etc. You can also get context through the JavaScript library, and you can do that by calling the Microsoft Teams.getContext. And that's going to give us context to Microsoft Teams that has all of these different properties I mentioned at the bottom. This is an asynchronous method, and it's only going to have a single success callback that's going to return the actual context object. So now that we've seen kind of a brief overview on how to extend Microsoft Teams, let's look at how we can deploy SharePoint Framework web parts as a custom Microsoft Teams tab. So there's some benefits to using the SharePoint Framework to create your Microsoft Teams tab. First of all, the development model is similar to building just a standard SharePoint Framework web part. In fact, it's pretty much the exact same. You're going to go through all the same process using Yeoman to generate your project, to using TypeScript and optionally React or another web framework to build the UI for your web part. And you're just going to build a web part just like you normally would. Now, any web part can then be exposed as a tab in Microsoft Teams. It's not exposed by default, but it's something that you could have if you wanted. You can also have different scoping options on exposing your tab as a web part or a tab in your tenant. So when you build a web part, if it's intended to only be used in SharePoint, you can list it just in SharePoint. If you want it to be used only as a tab in Teams, you can do that. If you want it to be available to be used in either case, you can do that as well. The tab is then going to be executed in the context of the underlying SharePoint site that's behind the specific team. So every Microsoft team is going to have its own SharePoint site collection that's backing it, where files are stored, etc. When the Microsoft Teams team is going to load the tab that contains your web part, what it's really doing is pointing to an iframe, and that iframe is pointing to a URL in that SharePoint site. And that SharePoint site, that page in the SharePoint site, is simply going to have a blank canvas page that's going to add the web part and its configuration information on the page. And that's what's going to be rendered inside of Microsoft Teams. So effectively, you're going to be inside of Microsoft Teams. You're going to go to a tab, and there's an iframe that represents the tab that is really just a view of the SharePoint page under the covers. Now, the cool thing about this is that then you can take advantage of any SharePoint specific APIs or functionalities within your web part. For example, you have access to the SharePoint REST API, the Microsoft Graph SDK, Azure AD secured endpoints. Everything that you're used to doing with the SharePoint framework can now be done straight inside of a Microsoft Teams tab that's built as a web part. Now, how are you going to surface your SharePoint framework web part into a Microsoft Teams tab? Well, the way you're going to do this is you're going to specify the web part can be a tab. And the way that that works is that there's a simple setting that you're going to apply inside of the manifest for your SharePoint framework web part. You're then going to create any images and descriptions, and you're going to define these things inside of your Teams tab. And that's all going to be defined inside of a Teams manifest file. So that manifest, it's just manifest.json, is going to be defined inside your project. Now, when we get to the deployment piece, I'll show you how there's a way that Microsoft will generate this manifest file for you on the fly and use specific images that you've provided, as well as use the settings from the web part as the same settings for your Microsoft Teams tab. So for example, the title, the descriptions, all of those things will still be the exact same inside of your Teams tab that you have inside your SharePoint Framework web part. However, you can override these things by providing your own manifest file. Again, we'll see how to do this when we get into the demo. So here's where you're going to specify the web part can be a Teams tab. The code block that you see there on the right, that JSON, is a manifest file for a SharePoint Framework web part. So everything there looks very familiar except for one line right in the middle that says supported hosts. This was introduced into the SharePoint Framework in version 1.8, and this can include a couple different options. For the sake of our topic that we're going through right now, there's really just two options that you really care about. If you want this to be listed as a web part inside SharePoint so it can be used as a traditional SharePoint Framework web part, you would list the option of SharePoint web part. If you want it to be used as a tab inside of Microsoft Teams, you would say Teams tab. So whenever you have one of these listed and one of them not listed, you're going to have these different cases of when these things can be used. You're then going to go create the different Teams tab images. Now, there are two images that are added to a new SharePoint Framework web part project by default. The file names are color and outline.png, and they have a prefix on them of a GUID. That GUID is the unique ID of your SharePoint Framework web part. So just above the red box in the code that you see there on the left, the SPFX Teams Together web part, that manifest file is going to contain a component ID, which is a GUID, and that GUID is the one that you see that's highlighted there. This is what the default image that you're going to see, just these two cog gear wheels inside of an image. You'll have one that's a little bit smaller and one that's a little bit bigger. You can change these out for something else if you so choose. You're then going to have to create the Microsoft Teams app manifest. So the way you do this, what needs to happen here is that you're effectively going to need to package up your application, the images and the manifest file, and then deploy them over to the Teams store so that Teams knows that this custom tab is an application that can be installed inside your Microsoft Teams experience. Now, this manifest file, as I said, contains the name, location of those images, contains the name and the description of the application, some about information that contains like some metadata like privacy and additional details about the publisher, and then the location of the underlying application. Now the SharePoint Framework web parts, just like Teams tabs, these have almost all the information that we need inside of the SharePoint Framework web part components manifest file. Now the nice thing about this is that once you've deployed your SharePoint Framework component to the app catalog in SharePoint, what's going to happen is that you're going to have this button that's going to show up in the ribbon that says Sync to Teams. And if your component has been flagged as a component that can be deployed as a Teams tab, when you click this button for Sync to Teams, when you have the SharePoint Framework or SharePoint package selected, the SharePoint Online and the Tenant App Catalog is going to create the SharePoint or the Microsoft Teams app manifest and the zip file package that contains the images and the manifest. It's going to create all of that on the fly and automatically deploy it over to the Microsoft Teams store. So it makes your installation process really simple. However, if you wanted to modify the manifest.json file, you can create your own manifest file and put it inside the Teams folder. And in the SharePoint deployment for Sync to Teams won't create a new one. It'll just use the one that you've provided it. And that's the way we're going to do it in the demo. So in the demo, we're going to see how to create a SharePoint Framework web part and then extend it to be a custom tab inside of Microsoft Teams. All right, let's now first start by creating a SharePoint Framework web part project. And we're then going to extend this to be able to be used in Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to start out first by creating a new folder for our project. And now I've done this, let's go ahead and let's run the SharePoint Framework generator. Now we're going to go ahead and just create the most basic thing that we can create here to keep it very simple on the different possibilities that we could have with this. I don't want to get too complicated in what all the different things that we could build, and just keep it very simple so you can focus on the SharePoint Framework component piece to it and the Microsoft Teams component piece to it. So I'm going to choose most of the default options here, but then it's going to ask me, do you want to let the tenant admin the choice of being able to deploy the solution to all sites? Now, if I didn't do this, I would have to go in and install our application into each one of the different site collections where my application could be used. Now in this case here, I'm going to go ahead and choose yes. And the reason why I want to do this is because every Microsoft Teams team has a SharePoint site collection that backs it, is kind of like the behind the scenes part to it. It's where files are stored and some other information is all stored there. Now by selecting yes here, I'm not going to have to go and install my application into that SharePoint site collection after I create my team. It's automatically going to be installed and available to me, which means that I don't have to this extra step that I'm going to have to do. This is going to make this web part available to every site collection throughout my tenant. I could, on the other hand, just install it inside of the site collections where I want it to be used, or I can just deploy it using the site collection scoped app catalog in SharePoint Online for each one of the different site collections. The thing here that you just have to keep in mind is that wherever you want to be able to use this as a custom tab, it's going to have to be installed inside of the site collection that is backing the Microsoft Teams team. Okay, that's the only thing you have to keep in mind here. So I'm just going to choose yes here to keep my demo a little bit easy. And then I'm going to choose most of the default options here, just saying we're going to create a web part. We'll call this Hello, SPFX, and Teams. And then we're just going to choose no JavaScript framework. Now I'm going to let the NPM package manager go ahead and download all the dependencies, and through the magic of video editing, we're going to go ahead and skip ahead so you don't have to wait for all this. All right, now we've created our project, so let's go ahead and take a look and see what we have. So if you've done anything with SharePoint Framework, you know that this is all just a standard SharePoint Framework web part. There's nothing special about this. It's all pretty basic, and everything is just going to work right out of the box. So what I can do is take this entire project now, and I can go ahead and package it all up and build it and deploy it to SharePoint. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say gulp build, and then we'll say gulp bundle ship, and gulp package solution ship. I'm going to let this process go ahead and finish. And once this finishes, we're going to deploy our SharePoint Framework customization to see this run inside of a SharePoint Online site collection. Okay, so now we have our SharePoint package has been created, so I can see that right here inside the SharePoint/solution. I see my SharePoint package. So let's go ahead and add this. So I'm going to go over here to my browser, and I'm going into my tenant scoped app catalog, and let's go find this file. So this file is going to be right here. We're going to grab this and drop them right in. I'm going to say let's make this solution available to all sites in the organization, which is what we were talking about a minute ago, where we said let make this available to all site collections. I'm going to go ahead and hit deploy, and then just to make sure that everything looks good, I'll scroll over here and make sure that it is a valid app package, it is deployed, it's tenant deployed, and it contains no errors. So we're in good shape. Let's come over here to a SharePoint site. So here I'm inside of a sub-site or a site collection within my, my tenant. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page. It's a standard SharePoint web part page. And let's go ahead and add in our web part. So I'm going to make this wide, and then I will choose the Hello Microsoft SharePoint Teams, SharePoint Framework and Microsoft Teams. I'll go ahead and add that in, and I'll just hit publish. So we can see, here we go, everything is running. So we're seeing this running inside of SharePoint. Now let's make this work inside of Microsoft Teams. So there's a couple things we have to do. First of all, I'm going to jump over to Teams, and I'm going to create a brand new team here just to use for my sample. So I'm going to say, let's create a team. We'll create it from scratch. It'll be a public team, and I'll make it be the My First Team. And then we'll just skip adding people to it. Now, what you can see here is that behind the scenes, there's a SharePoint site that has been created for this. Now it's going to go ahead and do this in the background. This is going to take a minute for it to finish. So if I refresh the page, it should show up in just a minute. And sure enough, now you can see we have a My First Team site collection was created. So we can see that's running behind the scenes. So now what I want to do is I want to add in a new tab, a custom tab for this. So I'm going to go ahead and click this plus sign, and I'm not going to find my tab inside of the list of all of the applications here, because while I've deployed this as a SharePoint Framework application, I've not provisioned this from SharePoint over to Microsoft Teams. So if I go over here to more apps, you can see here that I won't have it listed anywhere over here. I don't have anything that's been set up. So what I want to do is I'm going to want to upload a custom app. Now before I do that, what I'm going to need to do is come back over here to my project. And there's two ways I can do this. I can either, actually let's change this. Let's go back and let me show you something. If I come back over here to my app catalog, and if I select this application we uploaded, and if I come over here to files, you'll see that sync to Teams is disabled. Now the reason why this is disabled right now is because if I go back to my project and I look at the manifest, you can see that the supported host is just for a web part. What I want to do is I want to change this and make this a Teams tab. So I want to make this both a web part and a Teams tab. So I'm going to save my changes here. I need to go back and rebuild everything or repackage everything. And I'm going to redeploy it up to SharePoint. So let's come back over here to my app catalog, and let's grab our package, and I'll drop it in, replace the changes. And then I will go ahead and redeploy it. Now when that's done, I'm going to select it, and notice now when I select it, let's refresh the page. I have sync to Teams as an option. So what this would do is this would generate the Microsoft Teams app package, which will contain the two images in the manifest file, and automatically deploy those over to SharePoint. Now, I could do it this way. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it the more manual way to show you how you can have more control. So the steps that I'm going to show you right now are not required. They're just giving you additional details, and I'll show you where, if I click this sync to Teams, I'll show you where it would pick up where we pick up the demo. So let's jump back over here to the code, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file over here in Teams called manifest.json, and I'm going to paste in a manifest file. Now in the code associated with this screencast, you'll find a sample file that you can use if you so choose. So a couple things with this is that I'm going to put the manifest for my web part off to the side over here. So here's my manifest for my web part, and here's my manifest for my Teams tab. So what you're going to see is a lot of different things that have been set up that are aliased in here that I can replace. So the package name here, we'll just call this our Hello Teams web part. This is one. Another thing that we're going to need here is the component name. So I have to give it a name here. So I'll call this where the title is. Where's my title is right here. I will then grab the description, and I'll put the description right here for the short and the long description, except for the long one. What we'll do to see that there's a difference is I'll do short and long. And then I have these component IDs, and that's going to be the ID of the web part itself. So I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to do a quick find on this string right here. There's 3 instances of it. There's one inside, there's 2 for the icons, and then 1 in the configuration URL. So I'm going to replace and put that GUID in there for all those options. Now these 2 images here, these are the 2 images inside the Teams folder. So you can see that these 2 guys right here are these 2 images. The manifest file, the configuration URL, is telling the SharePoint Framework and Microsoft Teams what web part should be added on the page that's going to be surfaced in Teams. So now that that's done, I'm going to save my changes as manifest file, and I'm going to come back over here into Finder or into my Explorer, and I'm going to zip up these 3 files. And let's just call them and we'll do a SPFX Teams demo. All right, so now that's it. There's our zip file right there. So let's go back over to Microsoft Teams. And I'm going to do upload a custom app and choose upload to my tenant. So I'm going to choose my tenant. I'm going to go find that file. And now that it's uploaded, you can see here we have our tenant is now listed over here. Now after a minute, we should see the application show up. There it is. We have our Hello Microsoft Teams. You can see there's the long description. The short description isn't showing up just yet. So now what I can do is I can go ahead and install this. So I'm going to go back over here to my team, go into the General tab, and I'm going to choose, scroll down to the bottom, and there it is. There's my Hello SPFX. So you can see there's the short description that's showing up in the tooltip. So now when I select this, it's going to say, what team do you want to add it to? So I know it's already in the team that I'm in right now, so I'm going to add it to this team. And it's then going to, it doesn't show me the configuration option here that you would see if you do a normal Microsoft team, because you'll see where the configuration stuff kicks in just a minute. So I'll then say, hit save. So now it's set up my team, and now you can see that my team has, my tab has been set up now, and it's now rendering this web part. So this is a SharePoint Framework page. This is our web part property pane. You can see it works all the exact same way as a normal SharePoint Framework web part. And when I close this, I can go back in and I can edit my changes to this web part by going to settings and see these changes over here like this. When I delete those changes, hit the X, saves my changes. I can go off the team or off the tab and come back to the tab and see everything is running. So you can see that this is the exact same SharePoint Framework web part that is running inside of Microsoft Teams. It's just not the exact same one that we were seeing on our page here, because if I make changes to it over here, put SP in the name and hit publish. If I come back over here and I come back to the team or back to the tab, you'll see SP is not listed here. And the reason for that, again, is because, I'll put TM in here for this one, because they're actually on 2 different pages inside the SharePoint site. So TM here, come back over to our testbed page, and if I refresh this page, it still should say SP. So there, you've seen how to create a SharePoint Framework web part and then how to deploy it to Microsoft Teams as a custom tab. In this section of the Build Microsoft Teams customizations using the SharePoint framework, we're going to see how we can leverage SharePoint context and Microsoft Teams context within our components. We're first going to see how we can understand the SharePoint framework-based Microsoft Teams tabs. Then we're going to see how to work with the SharePoint context as well as the Microsoft Teams context in the same application. SharePoint Framework web parts have access to the current page context when they're loaded on a page. And this is going to give us access to the current page, site, and site collection information. In the SharePoint Framework version 1.8, it introduced the Microsoft Teams context object to the SharePoint Framework API. This is the same Microsoft Teams context object that's available from the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK, and you'll find it in an NPM package at Microsoft/Teams-JS. Use the presence of the Microsoft Teams context to determine if your SharePoint Framework web part is running in SharePoint or in Microsoft Teams. If the context comes back as undefined, you're in SharePoint. If it comes back populated, you're in Microsoft Teams. So here's a little code snippet of how this would work. You can see here at the top is I'm creating a private member variable called Teams Context that's of type Microsoft Teams.context. Then in my web parts on init method that's going to be executed by the SharePoint framework before rendering my web part on the page, it's going to return a promise that is going to check to see if the Microsoft Teams context object is available by saying this.context.Microsoft Teams. If we got something, then we're going to call getContext, and that's going to give us on a successful callback, give us back a Microsoft Teams context. Then inside my web part, so say we're in the render method, I can check to see, do we have this Teams context object present? And if we do, then I'm just going to set the value of the title property equal to Teams, otherwise it'll be SharePoint. And then I can do the same thing for checking for the current location. I can check to find out what's the name of the current team we're in. And if we're not in Teams, I'm just going to get the name of the current site that we're in. The best way to see how this works is in a real code demo. So let's jump back to our sample and let's update it, and then update it, the deployed sample, and see it running both in Microsoft Teams and in SharePoint to see the difference. So in the previous demo that we saw in this section, we already saw how to create a SharePoint Framework web part and deploy it to Microsoft Teams and use it as a custom tab. Now let's see how we can use some context info so that our web part knows if it's inside SharePoint or if it's inside Teams. So I'm going to come over here into my web part, and the first thing I need to do is I need to add in a reference to something. So I'm going to say import at Microsoft/Teams.js, and this is going to be we're going to import everything as Microsoft Teams. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a global scoped variable here, a global scope member as a Teams context. So Teams context, which is Microsoft Teams.context. Now, what I want to do is that when this web part is initialized, so we'll do our protected on init that returns a promise. What I want to do here is I want to go ahead and get an instance of the Microsoft Teams context, or at least set that setting here on this private member variable. So I'm going to do that by saying returning back a new promise and I'm going to check to see. I'll say if this context, look at the current page context, if you have a reference to Microsoft Teams. If you do, then I know that we are in Microsoft Teams. So if not, then I'm just going to resolve the promise. There's nothing to do here. In either case, actually, we're going to want to resolve the promise. But what I want to do in this case is I'm going to say this context dot Microsoft Teams dot get the context. I'll pass the context in, the Teams context in, and I'll say this Teams context is equal to the context that we just got. And we need to put the resolve inside so it actually waits for that to finish. Now what I can do is then come down here And let's go ahead and add in our render method, let's add a few things. Let's have a title property. And this title property will say, if there's a Teams context, then I'm going to say we're in Teams. Otherwise, we're in SharePoint. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Let the current location if we're currently inside of a Microsoft team, I'm going to say we're inside of the team called, let's actually do this as a string template literal. We'll do this.teamsContext.team name. Otherwise, we're going to be inside of a site collection. And we'll say this.context.page.context.web.title, like that. And so here, now when we come down here, let's render this out. I'm going to say, welcome to SharePoint or to Teams. And then I'm going to say that we are, for the subtitle, I'll say you're currently in the context of the following. And this is a current location. Like that. So what I didn't need to do is need to package it up and deploy it back to the SharePoint Online. So I'm going to come back over here to my command prompt and do a gulp build, gulp bundle, and gulp package solution using the ship flag for all of them. And we'll wait for this to finish. I don't have to do anything inside of Teams because remember, this web part is running inside of SharePoint. It's not running inside of Teams. Teams is simply has an iframe that's going to be exposing a SharePoint page where this web part is running. So let's come back over here to our component that we created, and let's go to SharePoint solution. Let's upload our manifest. And we're going to deploy our changes. We'll let that finish. Again, checking to make sure there's no errors. And let's go back over here to our web part page and refresh the page. Here we can see it's welcome to SharePoint, and we're currently in the context of the following site collection, vdemos 001, which is true. If I come over here to my team, and if I come to a different tab and then go back to our team, we'll see this get rendered and it shows we are currently in Teams and we're inside of the context of a Microsoft team called My First Team. So there we go. We can see how we can work with the different context objects and figure out where we are running the exact same application. That's really easy to be able to leverage a SharePoint context or Teams context inside the exact same code base. In this last section of building Microsoft Teams customizations using the SharePoint framework, let's take a look at some configuration options that we have. We're going to look at how we can do a custom Microsoft Teams tab configuration option, and then we're going to see how we configure it once during the installation process, and then also control how to edit it in the future, as well as blocking that same capability. Custom Microsoft Teams tab configuration options are going to include leveraging the SharePoint Framework public properties and property pane. SharePoint Framework web parts have public properties, or they can have public properties. And these public properties can be made editable to the users via the web part property pane that you can see there in the screenshot. SharePoint pages must be in edit mode in order to edit these properties, and users must have edit rights to the page to access the property pane. If you think about Microsoft Teams, it works a little bit differently. The way that this is going to work inside Microsoft Teams is that when the web part property pane is going to be displayed when a SharePoint Framework web part is installed as a tab in a Microsoft Teams team. So the experience you see on the right in the picture on the right, that's what you see when you first install a tab or a SharePoint Framework web part as a new tab. You're going to click that little X in the title bar of the property pane. And then once you do that, then you're just going to get the rendered web part. In the future, you can get back to those settings by selecting the drop-down menu on the custom tab and then picking the settings option. And that will open up the property pane again. And it works just like it normally does inside of the SharePoint framework. Now, you can also change the default setting here so that you can only modify the settings of the web part when it is initially installed as a tab. Because if you think about it, in SharePoint, we can only edit the properties of a web part if we put the page in edit mode, and that can only be done by people with specific rights. But in Microsoft Teams, it doesn't work the exact same way. Anybody can edit the properties or the settings of a tab. And so what I want to have the ability to do is say that only certain people can add a tab to a Microsoft Teams team, but not everybody can then go in and change the settings. And so what I can do is go into the manifest file for our custom Microsoft Teams team, or our tab, and I can change one of the properties on can update the configuration. I can change this from true to false. By default, it's going to be set to true, but you can change it to false if you want. And this is going back to the stuff that we talked about earlier in this screencast, where Microsoft can generate the manifest file for me on the fly in my project, but maybe I want to go make some changes to it myself and provide a custom manifest. This is one of those cases where I'd want to provide a custom manifest. So let's see in a demo how we can go about making some changes, adding some custom properties, and then also controlling who can make those edits. Now in this last demo, we want to take a look at how we can extend our existing application so that we can have additional configuration information inside of it. But I also want to see how we can control if in Microsoft Teams that you can only do the configuration when the tab is created and not later. So what we're going to do first is let's add in a new custom property. So I'm going to come over here, and we're going to add a new custom property. We'll just call it a custom setting that's of type string. And I want to render out this string onto the web part page. So I'm just going to duplicate where the description is, and we'll just have this be our custom setting as well. And then I need to give them a way to edit it. So I do that inside of our get property pane configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. And this was our custom setting. And then we'll just create a hard-coded label in this case here. So in this case, my hard-coded label is just going to be called custom setting, and we'll save our changes. All right. So now everything is done. We have our custom setting that's available to us. Let's now go ahead and build our project and redeploy it. So I'm going to run gulp build, gulp bundle with the ship flag, and gulp package solution with the ship flag, all in succession. All right. So here we go. Let's go back over here to our app catalog, and let's redeploy our application. All right, now that that's done, let's come back over here to our test bed and let's refresh the page. And I'm going to go into edit mode, and then we will edit the web part, and I can see I have a custom setting. So there we go, another setting that we can add, and we're seeing that show up right here. That's exactly how we would expect it to work inside of a SharePoint Framework web part. Now let's go over here to Teams and let's see how this works. I'm going to come back over here to Conversations, and let's go back over here to Teams. And I'm going to change the value, or change select the option here to go into the settings. Now notice that I have the settings option listed here. Notice we have a custom setting, so we have a Teams custom setting. All right, so everything looks good. Exactly how we would expect it. But I want to see how we can also block settings from showing up, and I only want this to show up when I add a new team. Because if you remember, when I add the team, or when I add the custom tab, so let's first go ahead and remove it. Now if I go in and add the team, add the custom tab back, which you can see right here, here's the tab that's available to us, and I hit save, notice that initially, again, we have our configuration experience show up. So some setting, right? But not only that, the experience is still available to me if I come over here and I pick the drop down for my tab and I choose settings. I can still see that experience. So let's see how we can block that from happening. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and remove this team again, or remove this tab. And while that's removing, let's go back over here to our code base. And what I have is over here in the manifest file, we have this option under the configurable tabs. I have an option here to can update the configuration. Right now it's set to true. Let's flip this to false and save our changes. All right, now once I've done that, I need to go in and recreate my team app package. So I'll do that by just selecting these guys and saying recompress it. And let's go ahead and throw this in the trash. And actually, there's one more thing we need to do here now that I think about it. We also need to bump the version because it won't see it as a new version until I bump the version number. So we're going to go from version 0.1 to 0.2. So we'll save those changes, and then we're going to go ahead and compress these 3 files. And now I'm going to go back over here into Teams. And if I go to the store and I choose my tenant, I want to update this application. So now my application has now been updated. So let's see what impact that's going to have. So let's come over here to Teams and let's go add in to our My First Team. Let's go add in our web part again. So I'll go ahead and hit save. Now, just as we would expect, we get the configuration experience showing up here. So Teams config experience. Once I close this, right now it's going to happen if I select the drop down, but if I come off the tab, just to be clear, and come back over here into the new tab, and I select this drop down, notice the settings button has now been removed. So I don't have the ability to modify any of the settings after the tab has already been created. That's a really cool little addition that we've added here to make things a little bit easier. And so in this experience, what you've seen is how we can work with the configuration settings. It's the same story we've had with the SharePoint framework, but with Microsoft Teams, we had the added ability to block people from adding multiple, from modifying the settings multiple times after we've had our initial installation. So in this screencast, we learned a lot about working with the SharePoint framework and Microsoft Teams. You understood what was involved in creating custom tabs in Microsoft Teams, and then how we can take advantage of the SharePoint framework and use the web parts that we create in the SharePoint framework and use those as custom tabs inside of Microsoft Teams. You also saw how we could create the Teams app manifest file both automatically and programmatically and have it deployed automatically for us to the Microsoft Teams store, or we could create it ourselves. And then in addition, we also saw how we could work with the different context objects, both the SharePoint context object and the Teams context object within our application. And then finally, we saw how we could modify the different configuration settings. I've added some links here for some additional details if you want to learn more about working with the SharePoint framework or in building Microsoft Teams tabs using the SharePoint framework. Thank you very much, and I hope you got a lot out of this screencast.